I had imagined my wedding day 1,000 times before it actually happened, and in every version it was perfect. Not perfect like a magazine, perfect like mine. String lights strung between the oak trees in my in-laws' backyard. My mother crying before I even walked down the aisle. My sister Dana standing beside me the whole ceremony holding my bouquet like it was made of glass. Dana had always been that kind of sister. The steady one. The one who showed up early to help set up chairs and stayed late to fold tablecloths. She was 3 years older than me, but she'd spent most of her adult life taking care of other people, our mother after the divorce, me through 2 bad breakups, and now finally herself. She'd just signed a lease on a new apartment 2 weeks before my wedding. A real fresh start. New city, new job, new everything. I remember hugging her at the rehearsal dinner and telling her, "This is going to be your year, Dana. I can feel it." She'd laughed and said, "Let's get you married first." Our mother used to say that Dana and I were built from the same clay but fired in different kilns. I was the one who cried at commercials and changed my mind twice a week about what I wanted from life. Dana was the one who made lists, who paid her bills 3 days early, who could tell you exactly how much was in her savings account without opening an app. When our parents' marriage fell apart when I was 14, it was Dana, only 17 herself, who sat with me on the bathroom floor while I sobbed, who learned to make our mother's favorite tea just the way she liked it during the worst of those months, who somehow became the adult in the room before she'd even finished being a teenager. I don't think I ever fully thanked her for that. You don't when you're the younger one. You just absorb the shelter someone builds around you and assume on some level that it will always be there. So when Dana finally signed that lease, a bright sunlit 2-bedroom in a converted Victorian near downtown with crown molding and a clawfoot tub, and a landlord who seemed almost too eager to have her, it felt like watching a plant finally get moved into good soil after years in a cramped pot. She'd sent me photos of the empty rooms with a caption that just said, "Mine." One word. I'd cried reading it, which she'd teased me about for a full week afterward. The reception was held at the Ashford Manor, a restored old estate my mother-in-law Carol had insisted on booking months in advance. Carol was particular about everything: the flowers, the seating chart, even the temperature of the champagne. She and my husband Peter had always had that kind of relationship, warm on the surface, but underneath it something more controlled. Peter used to joke that his mother ran her love life like a spreadsheet. I never quite understood what he meant by that until much later. The night was going beautifully. The band played our first dance song, an old Etta James tune Peter's grandmother used to hum, and for a few minutes I forgot to worry about anything. My father made a toast that made half the room cry. My best friend told an embarrassing story about our college days that made people laugh so hard someone knocked over a champagne flute. It was in every sense the kind of night you want to hold on to. Somewhere between the cake cutting and the bouquet toss, I noticed Carol pull Peter aside. She did this sometimes quiet, clipped conversations that never seemed to be about anything, and yet always left Peter a little quieter afterward. I didn't think much of it. It was a wedding. Mothers whisper things to their sons at weddings. Advice, sentiment, maybe even a joke about grandchildren. I was standing near the dessert table laughing with my cousin when I heard it. Carol had leaned toward Peter, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and in a voice just loud enough for those of us nearby to catch, she said, "Since everyone's here, have Marcus change the locks at her apartment." There's a particular kind of silence that happens inside a loud room, a silence that exists only for you, carved out of the noise around it, because your body has decided without asking permission that this sentence matters more than the band, more than the clinking glasses, more than the laughter rolling across the lawn. That's the silence I fell into. Everyone else kept talking. Somewhere behind me, my new mother-in-law's sister was telling a story about a cruise gone wrong, and someone was laughing so hard they snorted, and none of it touched me at all in that moment. I remember the sentence landing strangely like a piece of static in an otherwise smooth radio signal. It took me a beat to place who she meant. Marcus Peter's cousin on his mother's side ran a small locksmith side business, and apparently Carol wanted him to redo the locks before Dana moved her things in. It should have been an innocuous request. A practical, even kind gesture offering a discount, keeping the new tenant safe. But something in the way Carol said it made the back of my neck prickle. It wasn't offered like an act of generosity. It was said like an instruction. Urgent, almost rehearsed. I turned to look for Dana, some instinct pulling my eyes across the room, before my mind had even caught up to why. She was standing near the gift table, phone in hand, looking down at the lease paperwork she'd brought to show off to the family earlier that night. And in the span of maybe 3 seconds, I watched the color drain completely from her face. I've relived that moment more times than I can count since that night, trying to figure out exactly what she'd heard, exactly what she understood that I hadn't yet grasped myself. All I know is that one moment my sister was laughing with our aunt about wedding cake flavors, and the next she looked like she'd seen something reach up out of the floor and grab her by the ankle. She didn't say a word. She set down her champagne glass carefully, deliberately, like she didn't trust her hands not to shake it, and walked straight through the crowd toward the exit. She didn't stop to hug anyone goodbye. She didn't even look back at me. I remember standing there in my wedding dress torn completely in half. Half of me wanted to run after her immediately. The other half, the half that had spent months planning this exact night, knew that I couldn't just leave my own reception without an explanation, without causing a scene, without ruining something I'd worked so hard for. Hard. I caught Peter's arm. "What did your mom just say to you?" He blinked, and for half a second something flickered across his face that I'd later come to recognize as guilt. But in the moment, I mistook it for confusion. "She just wants Marcus to swap the locks before Dana moves in. It's a housewarming thing. Why, Dana just left. She looked like she was going to be sick." Peter's eyes drifted briefly toward his mother, who was now deep in conversation with my aunt, as if nothing at all had happened. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said. "You know how sensitive Dana's been lately with the move and everything? New job stress, probably." It was a reasonable answer. Dinah Howe had been stressed. She'd been overworking herself for weeks, trying to get everything in order for the move, packing, coordinating movers, finalizing her lease. It made sense that something as small as an overheard comment about locks might have tipped her exhausted nervous system into a moment of overwhelm. Except Dana wasn't the type to cry in public, let alone walk out of her only sister's wedding without a word. I tried calling her twice in the next 10 minutes, but the reception noise was too loud for me to hear, if it even rang. I sent a text, "Are you okay? Call me?" and slipped my phone back into the little beaded clutch my mother had given me for the occasion, promising myself I'd check again in a few minutes. The band started up again. Someone pulled me onto the dance floor. I smiled, I twirled, I let myself for just a moment be pulled back into the current of the party. And that's when my phone began buzzing violently against my hip, over and over, an incoming call cutting through the noise like a siren. It was Dana. I stepped off the dance floor so fast I nearly tripped over the hem of my dress, ducking into the coat closet off the Manor's main hallway, pressing the phone to my ear with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "Dana, what's going on? Are you okay?" There was a pause. A strange, static-filled pause, like she was standing somewhere. The signal didn't quite reach. And then I heard her voice, and it didn't sound like my sister at all. It was thin, cracked, like she'd been crying or screaming or both. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "I need you to listen very carefully. Dana, you're scaring me." "What happened?" I went back to the apartment. I wasn't supposed to go tonight, but I forgot my charger there, and I went to grab it real quick before the movers come tomorrow. Her breath hitched. "There's someone living down there." And then the call cut out. For a moment, I stood frozen in that coat closet, staring at my phone screen, the words, "Call ended, 041, glowing back at me like an accusation. I tried calling her back immediately. It rang twice and went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. My hands had started to shake, and not from the cold. Someone living down there. Down where the basement. Her new apartment building had a shared basement laundry storage units, an old boiler room, standard stuff for an older building. But the way she'd said it, it hadn't sounded like she'd stumbled onto a homeless person sleeping near the dryers. It sounded like something else. Something worse. I pushed open the closet door and nearly walked straight into Peter, who must have noticed me slip away. Hey, everything okay? You've been gone a while. Dana just called me. She said there's someone living in the basement of her building. And then the call just cut out. I could hear the tremor in my own voice. I need to go check on her. Peter's expression did something odd. A flicker of concern, yes, but also something tighter, more controlled underneath it, like he was calculating rather than simply reacting. Okay, let's not panic. It's probably a bad connection. That building's had spotty service since she signed the lease. I'll have Marcus swing by, he's not far from there. Peter, I need to go check on my sister. Right now. You can't just leave your own wedding reception. Watch me. I don't remember making the conscious decision to do it. One moment I was standing in the hallway of Ashford Manor in my wedding dress, and the next I was hiking the skirt of it up over my knees, kicking off my heels and heading for the parking lot. Barefoot keys somehow already in my hand, though I couldn't recall grabbing them. Peter caught up to me by the car. His tuxedo jacket half-buttoned, looking somewhere between concerned husband and man, trying to manage a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. At least let me drive you. You can't drive like this. He wasn't wrong. My hands were shaking too badly to trust myself behind the wheel. I climbed into the passenger seat, phone clutched in my lap, calling Dana over and over, each unanswered ring twisting the knot in my stomach tighter. She's fine. Peter kept saying more to himself than to me, I think. She probably just heard the building's radiator kick on. It makes this awful groaning sound. She probably just spooked herself. Then, why did your mom tell Marcus to change the locks tonight? At my wedding. Why did that need to happen? Tonight. Peter. He didn't answer right away. And in the silence that followed in the 15 seconds it took him to come up with something to say, I understood with a clarity that made my stomach drop that he knew more than he was telling me. My mom's known the previous tenant a long time, he finally said, eyes fixed on the road. There's history there. It's complicated. Complicated how? I don't really know the whole story. That's the truth. My mom doesn't talk about it much. But she made me promise before the wedding that I'd make sure the locks got changed before Dana moved anything in. She said it was important. She said it couldn't wait. I stared at him. And you didn't think to mention any of this to me or to Dana before she signed a year-long lease on that apartment. I didn't think it was... He stopped himself, swallowed. I didn't think it was that serious. We drove the rest of the way in silence, streetlights strobing across the windshield. My sister's unanswered calls piling up on my phone screen like small growing wounds. Dana's building was a converted 3-story Victorian on the edge of downtown. The kind of place with charming crown molding and a temperamental old boiler system, the kind realtors love to describe as having character. It had been split into 4 units decades ago, with a shared basement below for laundry and storage. Dana's unit was on the 2nd floor, but her storage space, like everyone else's, was down in that basement. The building looked ordinary from the outside. Warm light glowing behind curtained windows. A porch light left on. Nothing about it suggested anything was wrong, and for one brief foolish moment, I let myself believe that maybe this really was just an overreaction, Dana exhausted from moving, stress spooking herself over some strange noise, a stray cat, an old pipe groaning in the dark. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took me to find her. She was sitting on the front porch steps, still in the sundress she'd worn to my reception, knees pulled up to her chest, her phone lying face down beside her like she couldn't stand to look at it. When she saw me get out of the car, she made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Somewhere between a sob and a laugh, the kind of sound that comes out when a person has been holding something in so tightly that its release feels almost violent. I ran to her, dress and all, and pulled her into a hug so tight, I felt her whole body shaking against mine. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I am so sorry I ruined your wedding. I ruined your night. Dana, forget the wedding. Tell me what happened. It took her a few minutes to get the story out in full, her words coming in fragments between shaky breaths. She'd driven over after the ceremony to grab a phone charger she'd left behind during the move-in walkthrough earlier that week. The landlord had given her a key to the basement storage unit, and since she was there anyway, she'd decided to drop off a box of winter clothes early to save herself a trip later. The basement, she said, was dimly lit, just a single bulb near the stairs, and a scattering of bare bulbs further back near the storage cages. She'd walked past the boiler room, past the laundry machines, toward the cage marked with her unit number. And that's when she noticed that the storage unit 2 down from hers, one that was supposed to be empty according to the landlord, had a blanket draped over the wire mesh. Not folded, not stored. Hung like a curtain, like someone was trying to block the space from view. She said she almost didn't look. She almost just grabbed her box and left the way any reasonable person minding their own business would have. But there was something about the way that blanket hung too deliberate, too carefully arranged to be an accident that snagged at some old animal part of her brain and wouldn't let go. So she stepped closer. She told me later that her heart was already pounding before she even reached out to move the fabric aside. Like some part of her already knew what she'd find before her eyes confirmed it. What she saw in there in that flickering half-light was a sleeping bag rolled out neatly against the concrete floor, a flat pillow at its head gone gray with use. A pillow, a half-eaten sandwich still in its wrapper resting on an overturned milk crate that had clearly been repurposed as a nightstand. A row of canned food lined up along the wall with almost military precision. A phone charger plugged into an outlet that shouldn't have had power routed to it at all. An outlet. She realized with a slow, crawling horror that must have been rigged specifically for that purpose by someone who knew that basement well enough to bypass whatever the landlord thought was controlling it. Someone had been living down there. Not for a night, not for a week. This had the settled, practiced look of a life lived in the margins for a very long time. And then she said she heard footsteps. Not from the stairs behind her, but from deeper in the basement, from somewhere past the boiler room, in a section of the space she hadn't even known existed. She hadn't stayed to see who it was. She'd run. I looked past her toward the building, toward the small basement-level window set low against the foundation, its curtain hanging slightly crooked, as if someone inside had just let it fall back into place moments before we arrived. "Did you call the landlord?" I asked. "I tried. No answer." Dana's hands were trembling in mine. "I called you instead. I don't know why. I needed to hear someone's voice." Peter had gone quiet beside us, staring at that basement window with an expression I couldn't quite place. And it was in that silence, in the space between my sister's fear and my husband's stillness, that I felt the first real chill of the night, not from the temperature, but from the sudden sinking certainty that whatever was happening here, Peter's family already knew far more about it than they'd ever let on. I confronted Peter in the car on the way to his mother's house, still in my wedding dress. Mascara streaked down my face from crying Dana following behind us in her own car because she refused to be left alone. And honestly, I didn't blame her. "You're going to tell me everything you know," I said. "Right now, before we get there." Peter's jaw was tight, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. "I don't know everything. I swear to you I don't. But I know it has to do with a man named Russell Combs. The name meant nothing to me, and I told him so. He used to be my mom's tenant," Peter said. "Years ago, before I was even in college. She owned that building, the one Dana's moving into, before she sold it about 8 years back. Russell lived in the basement unit for almost 2 years. Not legally, not on any lease. My mom let him stay there off the books because his sister, my mom's closest friend growing up, had asked her to look after him. He'd had some kind of breakdown. Lost his job, lost his apartment. My mom felt responsible." "Responsible how?" Peter hesitated. "There was an accident. A car accident years before that, when they were all in their 20s. My mom was driving. Russell's sister was in the passenger seat. She didn't survive it. My mom walked away without a scratch." His voice grew quieter. "She's carried that guilt her whole life. Letting Russell stay in that basement, I think it was the only way she knew how to make amends. Like she owed him something she could never fully repay." I stared at him, my mind racing to connect fragments that still didn't fit together into something whole. "Okay, so Russell lived in the basement years ago with your mom's permission. That still doesn't explain why he'd be down there. Now, in a building she doesn't even own anymore. Because she never told the new owners about him, Peter said. And there it was, the thing he'd clearly been dreading having to say out loud. When she sold the building, Russell was supposed to move out. My mom found him a room somewhere, paid the first few months herself. But somewhere along the way, he came back. My mom's known for a while that he's been sneaking back down there using an old key she never bothered to change when she sold the place, since it wasn't her problem to fix anymore. She's been paying him off quietly, slipping him cash to stay hidden, stay quiet, stay out of the way of the actual tenants. I don't think she ever expected anyone new to move in and notice him. The pieces clicked into a shape I didn't want to look at directly. So when your mom found out Dana was moving into that exact building, into the one place her secret was hiding, she panicked. And instead of just telling us, instead of just being honest, she tried to have the locks changed quietly, hoping it would just solve itself, hoping Russell would just disappear before anyone found out. Peter didn't answer. He didn't need to. We arrived at Carol's house to find her already awake, sitting in her kitchen in her bathrobe, a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, looking like a woman who'd been waiting all night for a phone call she dreaded. When she saw my face, saw Dana's face behind me, still pale, still trembling, something in her posture collapsed. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. "You knew he was living down there. You knew before Dana ever signed that lease." Carol's hands folded together on the table, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual sharpness, just an old, worn-down exhaustion. "I tried to protect everyone," she said. "Russell from being reported and losing what little stability he has left. Dana by having the locks changed before she ever had to know he existed. Myself, I suppose, from having to admit what I've been doing for 8 years. She looked up, finally meeting my eyes. "I never meant for anyone to be frightened. I thought I had more time. I thought Marcus would get there before you all did. You should have just told us," I said, my voice cracking now, all the fear of the night finally breaking loose as anger. A stranger was living feet away from where my sister was about to sleep every night, and instead of telling her, you tried to quietly manage it like it was a scheduling conflict. Dana had been quiet this whole time, standing just behind me in the doorway of Carol's kitchen, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, though the house was warm. Now she spoke, and her voice was steadier than I expected, though it still shook at the edges. "How long have you been paying him to stay hidden, I mean?" Carol's eyes dropped to the teacup in front of her, tracing the rim with one finger as though the answer might be written somewhere along its edge. "Almost the whole 8 years since I sold the building," she said quietly. "Not constantly. There were stretches where he'd disappear, get a room somewhere, try to get back on his feet, and I'd think finally it's over, he's going to be all right. And then a month later, sometimes longer, he'd call me from a payphone or a borrowed cell, and I'd know before he even said anything that he was back down there again. I couldn't say no to him. I still can't. Every time I try, I see his sister's face in the seconds before the crash, and I lose whatever resolve I'd managed to build." "That's not an excuse," Dana said. "That's not Carol. That's not an excuse for letting me move in without knowing there was a stranger sleeping 30 feet from my kitchen." "I know." Carol's voice cracked properly. Then the composed woman who had orchestrated my entire wedding down to the napkin folds finally coming apart at the seams. "I told myself I had it handled. I told myself Marcus would change the locks before you ever had a reason to go down there yourself. And that would be the end of it. Russell would find somewhere else, and none of you would ever have to know any of this happened. I see now how foolish that was. I was so afraid of the truth costing me something that I let it almost cost you both something far worse." I studied her face in the harsh kitchen light, the fine lines around her eyes that I'd always assumed came from a life of careful composure, not from decades of carrying a guilt she'd never once spoken of to any of us. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made it at least comprehensible, the shape of a woman so terrified of losing the one thin thread of penance she had left that she'd risked the safety of the family she was marrying into, rather than let that thread snap. "You should have just told us," I said again, quieter this time because there was nothing left to shout about. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had exhausted itself, leaving behind something closer to grief. Carol had no real answer for that. There wasn't one to give. The police found Russell Combs later that night, still in the basement, curled up against the far wall behind the boiler, exactly where Dana had heard the footsteps. He didn't resist. He didn't even seem surprised. Officers described him as thin, disoriented, and cooperative. A man who seemed almost relieved to finally be found rather than to keep hiding. He wasn't arrested, not exactly. There was no crime in being unhoused, and the new owners of the building, once everything came to light, chose not to press trespassing charges, moved instead by the strange, sad tangle of guilt and grief that had kept him tethered to that basement for 8 years. A local outreach organization got involved. Last I heard, Russell was in transitional housing, receiving the kind of consistent support Carol's quiet cash payments had never quite managed to provide. Dana didn't move into that apartment. She broke the lease the following week, taking the financial hit without a second thought, and stayed with our mother for nearly 2 months before finding somewhere new. Somewhere with no history, no basement secrets, no ghosts of other people's guilt hiding in the walls. Peter and I didn't talk for 3 days after the wedding. 3 days into what should have been the happiest chapter of my life. And instead, I lay awake each night wondering what else his family might be hiding, wondering how a man could keep something like that from the woman he was marrying, even if it wasn't technically his secret to tell. We eventually talked it through, really talked the kind of raw, uncomfortable honesty that either breaks a marriage in its first month or becomes the foundation it's built on. For us, it became the second thing, but it took a long time, longer than either of us expected. Carol and I have a different relationship now than we did before that night. Quieter, more careful. She apologized to Dana in person several times in the months that followed. Apologies Dana accepted with the same weary grace she'd always shown everyone else in our family, even when she probably shouldn't have had to. Carol still carries the guilt of that old accident. I think the way some people carry a stone in their pocket their whole lives, reaching in to touch it now and then just to remember it's still there. I don't think that will ever fully go away for her. I'm not sure it's supposed to. Sometimes I think about that moment at the reception, the exact second Carol leaned over and whispered those words to Peter, the exact second Dana's face went pale across the room. If she hadn't overheard it, if she hadn't gone back for that charger, if she hadn't looked twice at that blanket hanging over the storage cage, instead of walking straight past it like anyone else might have, I think about how close we all came to never knowing. How Dana might have moved in the very next day, might have spent her first night in that apartment, completely unaware that a stranger was sleeping in the walls beneath her, kept there by a secret 8 years in the making. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and Peter is already asleep beside me, I think about Russell, about how long he must have lain awake down there in the dark, listening to footsteps overhead that belonged to people who had no idea he existed. I think about how easily a secret kept out of guilt instead of malice can still end up costing someone their peace, their trust, almost their safety. Dana's fine now. Better than fine, actually. She has a new apartment, a new sense of caution she probably didn't have before, and a habit of always checking the basement herself before she trusts anyone else's word that it's empty. She jokes about it now in the dry way she jokes about most things that once frightened her, calling herself the family's designated basement inspector. But I've noticed she never actually laughs when she says it. She just says it and moves on to the next subject. The way you do with a scar you've made peace with, but still don't. Especially like looking at... Our mother has her own theory about all of it, one she's shared with me more than once over coffee. She thinks some houses just hold on to things. Not ghosts, not anything so dramatic, but grief. The ordinary humankind, the kind that gets tucked into walls and floorboards by the people who lived through it, and never quite managed to let it go. I don't know if I believe that, not literally. But I understand what she means. That basement held 8 years of someone's unspoken shame, and it very nearly swallowed a piece of my sister's life whole before any of us even knew to be afraid of it. But every so often when she calls me late at night just to talk, there's a small pause before she says goodbye. A breath like she's listening for something. I never ask her what she's listening for. I think some nights we both already know.